The lamp was still burning when Amos Covington rode his gray mare down along the creek bed at the first gray edge of dawn, and the sight of that warm orange glow in the farmhouse window stopped him cold in the saddle, because every other homestead between Caldwell and the Colorado border had gone dark hours ago. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Kansas plains had been merciless that year. The grasshoppers had come through in July like a biblical punishment, stripping everything green down to bare brown dirt, and what the grasshoppers had missed, the drought had finished. Amos had been riding the long circuit from his brother's ranch near Wichita back toward the cattle trail, carrying nothing more important than a saddlebag full of hardtack, a bedroll, and the quiet company of his own thoughts. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that had grown a little too long and a jaw that hadn't seen a proper razor in 2 weeks. He was not a man given to sentiment, or at least that was the story he told himself. But that lamp burning in the window of the little clapboard house on the rise above Becker's Creek, that stopped him the way very few things had stopped him in his adult life. A man left a lamp burning all night for one of 2 reasons, in Amos Covington's experience. Either something had gone terribly wrong, or someone was terribly afraid of the dark. He sat there on that mare, watching the pale smoke curl from the chimney and the steady orange eye of the lamp in the window, and something about it pulled at him the way a current pulls at a man's boots when he wades too deep into a river. He turned the mare off the creek trail and rode up the gentle slope toward the house. The place had seen better seasons. The fence rails along the eastern pasture had half collapsed, leaning against one another like tired old men. The barn needed at least 2 new boards on its southern wall. The kitchen garden, what was left of it, had been reduced to dry gray stalks, but the house itself was kept with a kind of stubborn dignity. The porch swept clean, a pair of work boots standing neatly by the door, a line of dried herbs hanging from the eave where someone had bothered to save what little the season had allowed. Amos tied his mare to the fence post and removed his hat before he knocked, because his mother had raised him well enough to know that you did not approach a lone woman's door at dawn with your hat on your head. He knocked twice, soft and steady, the way you knock when you mean to be heard but not to alarm. There was a long pause. He heard movement inside, the creak of floorboards, and then a woman's voice, low and careful, came through the door. "Who is it?" "Name's Amos Covington, ma'am. I was riding the creek trail and I saw your light. I don't mean any trouble. I just wanted to make sure everything was all right." Another pause. He heard something that might have been whispering on the other side of the door, more than one voice, small voices, and then the sound of a bar being lifted. The door opened. Clara Hurst was 30 years old, with dark circles under eyes that were the color of creek water in summer, somewhere between gray and green, and those eyes were measuring him with a sharp intelligence that made him feel briefly like a man being assessed for purchase at an auction. Her brown hair was pulled back from her face in the loose, half-undone arrangement of someone who had not slept. She was wearing a calico dress that had been mended at the cuffs, and she was holding a cast-iron skillet in her right hand in a way that suggested she knew exactly what to do with it. Behind her, Amos could see 4 boys arrayed in a loose cluster in the kitchen doorway, the oldest maybe 11 or 12, the youngest probably no more than 5, all of them watching him with the same wary, watchful expression their mother wore. 4 sets of eyes, all of them the same shade as their mother's. "You are riding the creek trail before sunrise," Clara said, and it was not quite a question. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the exhaustion underneath it, like a stone beneath running water. "I am. I'm heading toward the cattle trail. My brother has a spread near Wichita, and I've been staying there for the season." He kept his hands visible, his hat held at his chest. "I saw the light and I thought I just wanted to make sure." Clara looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked down at the skillet in her hand, seemed to recognize it for what it was, not a cooking instrument in this context, but a weapon, and she lowered it slowly. "The boys couldn't sleep," she said, "and I couldn't either, so we kept the lamp on. Is everything all right, ma'am?" Her chin lifted slightly. It was a small movement, but it was full of information. "We've had better months," she said. "The harvest didn't come in." Those 4 words carried the weight of everything. The whole catastrophe of a Kansas autumn in 1878 compressed into 4 words. Amos looked past her at those 4 boys, 2 of them barefoot, one of them holding the smallest one's hand, and he understood that this woman had been sitting up all night not out of fear exactly, but out of the particular grinding anxiety of a person trying to work out a problem that might not have a solution. She had been running numbers in her head. He had done it himself in harder years. "Ma'am, I don't want to intrude," he said carefully. "But I know a thing or two about farms, and I'm not expected anywhere for a week and a half. If there's work that needs doing—" "We don't take charity," Clara said, and she said it the way a person says something they have said many times before, a kind of reflex worn smooth by repetition. "It's not charity if I'm working for it," Amos said. "I eat a good deal and I sleep hard. You be feeding a hand and getting the labor." She stared at him. He stared back. Behind her, one of the boys, the second oldest, maybe 9 years old, with a scattering of freckles across his nose, said quietly, "Mama, the fence on the east pasture has been down for 6 weeks." Clara Hurst closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. When she opened them, there was something different in them, something that might have been the very first crack in the door of her composure. "You'll sleep in the barn," she said. "I'll feed you breakfast and supper. You'll work daylight to dark. And you'll tell me your full name and where you're from before you come 1 step further onto this property." "Amos Covington," he said again. "Born in Tennessee, raised in Kansas. My father was a farmer before he was a cattleman. I know which end of a plow faces front." And something happened then, very small, almost invisible. The corner of Clara Hurst's mouth moved, just barely, in what might have been the ghost of a smile, and she stepped back from the door and said, "Then you had better come in and eat before the boys eat everything I've got left." Her oldest boy was named Thomas. He was 12 years old and had his father's name according to a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, Thomas Hurst Sr., a lean, serious-faced young man who had died of fever in the spring of 1876, 2 years before this story properly begins. Thomas Jr. carried his father's name and something of his father's seriousness, a responsibility to the household that sat a little too heavy on 12-year-old shoulders, and Amos noticed it in the way the boy watched him, measuring him not with a child's curiosity, but with the particular vigilance of a boy who had appointed himself the man of the house, and was not entirely sure he wanted to be relieved of that post. The second boy was named Eli, and he was the one with the freckles, 9 years old and full of a restless energy that expressed itself in fidgeting and constant questions. He was the one who had mentioned the fence, and within 20 minutes of Amos sitting down to a breakfast of cornmeal porridge and dried apricots, Eli had asked him 6 direct questions about horses, 3 about cattle, 1 about what Wichita looked like, and 1 about whether he had ever seen a buffalo. "I've seen a few," Amos told him. "Not as many as there used to be." Eli took this in with the solemnity it deserved. "Papa said there used to be so many they turned the whole prairie black." He was right about that. The third boy was named Sam, and he was 7, a quieter child who sat close to his mother and watched Amos with large, serious eyes and said almost nothing for the first 2 days, which Amos later came to understand was simply Sam's way. The boy was a thinker, not a talker. The youngest was named Henry, and Henry was 5 years old and had a gap where his front teeth had been, and the cheerful adaptability of a child too young to have fully absorbed the weight of the household's difficulties. By the end of the first breakfast, Henry had climbed off his bench, walked around the table, and pressed himself against Amos's knee with the trusting solidity of a small animal seeking warmth. "Henry," Clara said, her voice firm but not unkind, "leave the man alone while he eats." "He doesn't mind," Henry said, with the serene confidence of a 5-year-old. Amos looked down at the boy leaning against his knee and then up at Clara across the table and said, honestly, "He's right. I don't mind." Clara looked at him for a moment with that measuring gaze, and then she turned back to the stove, and Amos thought he might have caught the very faint color of something rising in her cheeks, though the morning light was dim enough that he could not be certain. The work was real and it was considerable. The east pasture fence consumed the entire first morning, 3 hours of digging new post holes in hard, dry ground, 2 hours of running new rails, all of it done in the company of Thomas and Eli, who worked with a focused determination that told Amos everything about how their mother had raised them. Thomas barely spoke but worked steadily and well. Eli spoke constantly and worked just as well, which Amos found he liked enormously. The barn roof had a gap in the southern corner that had been letting the autumn wind straight in, and that was the afternoon's work, Amos going up on the roof with a bag of nails and several boards from a stack behind the barn, while Clara stood below and handed things up when he called for them. It was the first time they were properly alone, the boys having been sent to gather what dried corn remained in the far field, and the silence between them had a different quality than the busy silence of working around children. Amos worked and Clara stood below with her arms crossed against the chill, and he was aware of her the way you become aware of something that has been in your peripheral vision for a while, gradually, and then all at once. "You don't have to be up there all afternoon," Clara said eventually. "The gap won't close itself," Amos said from the roof. "That's true enough." A pause. "How long did you say you had?" "Week and a half before I'm expected on the trail." He drove a nail solid and clean. "Plenty of time." Another pause. "Where are you headed after?" "Colorado eventually. There's work through the winter if you know where to look." He drove another nail. "What about you? What are your plans for the winter?" It was a direct question, and he knew it was direct, but he felt somehow that Clara Hurst was a woman who appreciated directness over the careful circling that strangers often did around hard subjects. She was quiet for long enough that he looked down to make sure she was still there. She was, standing with her gaze fixed on the middle distance, the dry field and the gray sky beyond it. "I have 4 children and a house, and not enough preserved food to get comfortably through February," she said, in the flat, factual tone of someone who has decided that the truth is less exhausting than the alternative. "My nearest neighbor is 6 miles east, and her husband died in the same fever that took Thomas, so she isn't any better off than I am. There's a town 9 miles north and a church congregation that has been generous." She paused. "I have a plan. It's not a comfortable plan, but it's a plan." Amos came down from the roof and picked up his tools. He stood close enough to speak quietly and not so close as to make her uncomfortable. "What's the plan?" he asked. Clara looked at him. The afternoon light was falling at an angle across her face, and he noticed, not for the first time, that she had a quality of stillness when she was thinking, a gathering of herself, like a person preparing to do something they have decided must be done. "I'm going to write to my cousin in Missouri," she said. "She has a house with 2 spare rooms. I'll take the boys and go there for the winter. Come back in the spring and see what can be planted." She paused. "Sell a portion of the east pasture if I have to buy seed." "That's a sound plan," Amos said. "It's a survival plan," Clara said. "They're not always the same thing." He looked at her. She looked back. The wind moved between them, smelling of dried grass and coming cold. "No," he said. "They're not." That evening, after supper, the boys were sent to bed by degrees, Henry first, protesting mightily, then Sam, then Eli, and finally Thomas, who went with the quiet dignity of someone who understood the adult conversation happening at the kitchen table was not his business, even as he clearly wanted to know what it was. Clara poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and set one in front of Amos without asking if he wanted it, because she had noticed over the course of the day that he was a man who needed coffee the way other men needed whiskey, frequently and without making a fuss about it. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, the same lamp that had burned all night, now turned down to a steady glow, and they talked. Not about grand things, not at first. They talked about the farm, the condition of the soil, the likelihood of a better season next year if the water table recovered, the price of grain in Caldwell that fall. They talked about Kansas, which was both of their home territory, Clara having been born 30 miles east of where they sat and Amos having grown up in the central part of the state before his father had moved the family to Tennessee and then back again. They talked about the grasshoppers, which felt like something that ought to be talked about, as though discussing the disaster might reduce its power. But then the coffee cooled and the silence between stories grew comfortable rather than awkward, and Clara said, without any particular preamble, "What are you actually looking for, Amos Covington?" He turned his coffee cup in both hands. "What do you mean?" "I mean a man of 31 with your abilities and your sense doesn't spend his autumn riding the creek trail between Wichita and the cattle run unless he's looking for something or running from something." She met his eyes with perfect directness. "And you don't strike me as a man who runs." He was quiet for a moment. He appreciated very much that she had not softened the question. "I was engaged," he said, 3 years ago, to a woman in Wichita. She married my brother's business partner instead." He paused. It wasn't a shattering kind of grief, more like the feeling when you walk into a room and forget what you went in for, a kind of disorientation. He looked up. "I've been working since then, and I think I've been working partly so I didn't have to think about what I was actually looking for." Clara was watching him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Not pity, he was grateful for that, something more like recognition. "Thomas died in March of '76, she said. "Henry was too. I spent that whole spring in a kind of numbness, like the cold had gotten inside me and I couldn't warm up." She looked down at her coffee. "The boys got me out of it. They needed feeding and schooling and holding together, and it turned out that was enough to get you out of bed in the morning." She paused. "I don't talk about it much. But you asked an honest question and I gave you an honest answer, so it seemed only fair." "I didn't ask," he said. "No," she said, "but you would have eventually." He looked at her across the lamp. "Is that right?" "I've found that kind men always do," she said, and there was something in the word kind that landed differently than he expected, as though she were offering it carefully, the way you offer something fragile. He went to the barn that night and lay on his bedroll in the hay with his hands behind his head, and stared at the boards above him for a long time before he slept. And when he slept he dreamed of nothing worth recording, just the amber light of a lamp in a window, and the particular gray-green of a pair of eyes looking straight at him without apology. The days that followed had a rhythm to them, and Amos found, to his own mild surprise, that he liked the rhythm more than he had liked anything in a considerable while. He was up before dawn always, which meant he was up before Clara, which meant he had the stock fed, and the water fetched from the well before the house came to life. He discovered on the second morning that Clara came down at first light and stood on the porch for exactly 5 minutes before she did anything else, a cup of hot water in her hands, looking out at the field. He did not interrupt this. He understood it to be something private, the 5 minutes between the night's worries and the day's work, a boundary she had drawn for herself. On the third morning, he came in from the barn and found her on the porch as usual, and she turned and held out a second cup without a word, and he stood beside her on the porch for those 5 minutes in the early cold, and that was the beginning of something, though neither of them would have called it that at the time. Thomas began to warm to him, cautiously, on the 4th day, when Amos helped him repair a section of the kitchen garden fence that the boy had been trying to fix for 2 weeks without quite the right tool. They worked side by side for an hour, Amos explaining each step without condescension, treating the boy's efforts with the straightforward respect that Thomas, it was clear, had been hungry for since his father died. When they finished, Thomas stood back and looked at the completed fence with an expression of quiet satisfaction, and then he looked at Amos and said, "My father used to say a good fence is just a good argument made with wood." Amos considered this. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was," Thomas said. He picked up the tools and began carrying them toward the barn, and then he paused and looked back. "I think he would have liked you," he said, with the careful awkwardness of a 12-year-old boy delivering a significant gift, and then he walked on before Amos could answer. Amos stood there for a moment looking at the fence, and he was aware of something in his chest that felt like the particular ache of a wound that is in the process of healing, not pleasant exactly, but purposeful. On the 5th day, Clara caught him teaching Eli how to estimate the depth of a well by listening to the echo of a dropped stone, and she stood in the kitchen doorway watching them with an expression on her face that Amos did not see because his back was to the house, but which Sam, sitting nearby with a piece of chalk and a slate he used for his letters, observed with the careful attention of a 7-year-old who noticed more than people generally gave him credit for. Sam came to stand beside his mother in the doorway, and Clara looked down at him, and Sam looked up at her, and they did not say anything at all, but Clara put her hand on the boy's shoulder and Sam leaned into her side, and that was a conversation complete in itself. On the 6th evening, there was a crisis. The kind of small, sharp crisis that farm life produces without warning. Eli, in a fit of the exploring energy that governed him, had climbed to the upper loft of the barn to investigate what he claimed was a bird's nest, and had come down the wrong way and twisted his ankle badly enough that he could not put weight on it. He did not cry, not because he was trying to be brave, but because he was the kind of child who defaulted to loud, indignant complaining instead of tears, which Clara seemed to find simultaneously exhausting and endearing. Amos carried him into the house and Clara examined the ankle with competent hands, determined it was not broken, and bound it tightly with a strip of cloth while Eli narrated the entire event in enormous detail, including a description of the bird's nest which he was annoyed he hadn't gotten a proper look at before the fall. Was it worth it? Amos asked him, settling him onto the bench with his foot elevated. I don't know, Eli said darkly. I didn't get to see the nest. Then it probably wasn't worth it. But it might have been a meadowlark, Eli said. I've been trying to find a meadowlark nest for 2 years. Amos considered this with the seriousness it deserved. I'll look tomorrow. You can describe exactly where it is and I'll go up and check. Eli's expression shifted from indignant to intensely interested. You have to check if there are eggs, blue-gray with spots. I'll check. Eli seemed satisfied by this, and settled back with the air of a boy who has successfully delegated. Clara, kneeling on the floor with the bandage in her hands, glanced up at Amos with an expression that did something very specific to his composure, or rather, to the effort required to maintain it. It was a soft expression, unguarded, the kind that surfaces on a person's face when they are moved and are not quite quick enough to conceal it. And what it said, without words, was something like, "You are a good man, and I did not expect to find you on my doorstep." He went back to the barn that night feeling both better and worse than he had felt in a long time, which is the particular condition of a man who has begun to care about something he is not at all certain he has a right to care about. On the 7th morning, they had the conversation that changed things. Amos had been up since before dawn, as usual, and he had been doing something he had not entirely acknowledged to himself. He had been walking the farm with a different kind of attention, not the attention of a man cataloging work that needed doing, but the attention of a man thinking about what this farm could be with proper time and effort and weather. The south field had good soil under the dust. The pasture, even depleted, had the right lay of the land for expansion. The water table from Becker's Creek, if the winter was wet enough, would recover. He had been thinking about all of this with a dangerous specificity. Clara found him at the edge of the south field, standing with his hands in his coat pockets looking at the dry ground. She came and stood beside him and they both looked at the field for a while. "What are you seeing?" she asked. "Potential," he said. She made a short sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something sadder. Thomas always said the same thing about this field. He bought this land specifically for this field. He said if the water stayed right and the weather cooperated, this could be wheat country. He was right, Amos said. I've seen worse soil produce good wheat. You farmed wheat. 2 seasons before I went to cattle. He paused. I know what to look for. Clara was quiet for a moment. The morning was pale and cold, the grass silver with frost, and she had wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "I keep thinking," she said carefully, "that the right thing to do is to go to my cousin in Missouri and be safe through the winter. That's the responsible choice, the practical choice." She paused. "But there is a part of me that—" She stopped. "That what?" Amos asked quietly. She turned her head to look at him. "That has kept this farm going for 2 years by herself, and does not particularly want to be someone's guest for the winter. Someone's burden." She said it steadily, without self-pity, just as a statement of something true. "You wouldn't be a burden," he said. "I would be a widow with 4 boys imposing on a cousin who is being kind," Clara said. "That's a burden, Amos. It's a fine and generous one, and I am grateful for it, but it's a burden." He looked at her. She was looking back at him now, straight on, with that directness that he had come in a week to understand was simply the way Clara Hurst moved through the world. She did not soften things to make them easier to handle. She looked at them plainly. "What if there was another option?" he said. "Such as?" "Such as having someone here who could help see the farm through the winter. Someone who knows soil and stock." And he stopped himself. He ran a hand through his hair. He was aware that he was on the edge of something and that the next step needed to be taken with care. "I'm going to say something, and I want you to understand I'm not saying it because I think you can't manage. It's plain you can manage. I've watched you manage all week." Clara's expression was careful and attentive. "I'd like to stay," he said. "Not for a week and a half. Through the winter and into the spring planting if you'll have me." He met her eyes. "I'm not proposing anything beyond work. I want to be clear about that. I would sleep in the barn and work the land, and I'd expect nothing from you except the same arrangement we already have. But I would like to see this farm through to a decent harvest." He paused. "If you're willing." Clara Hurst was quiet for a long time. The frost on the grass caught the early light and turned it silver. "Why?" she asked finally. It was the right question, and he knew a dishonest answer would cost him everything, so he chose honesty. "Because I have been riding creeks and following cattle for 3 years, and not feeling much about any of it," he said. "This past week I have felt more like myself than I have in all of those 3 years put together." He paused. "That's not nothing, and I think you know it." She looked at him for a long and searching moment, then she looked back at the field. "You would stay through the winter," she said, in the barn, and you would expect nothing." "Work," he said, "and that coffee in the mornings." A silence. "Then the boys are starting to rely on you." "I know. That's not a simple thing." "I know that too." She breathed out, a long, slow breath that misted in the cold air. "I am going to tell you something honestly, Amos, because I have found that honesty is the only currency that doesn't lose its value." "All right. I am not a woman who does things halfway," she said. "If I allow this, if the boys come to rely on you and you decide in February that Colorado is calling after all, that will be worse than if you leave now. I want you to understand that." "I understand it. I am not asking you to make me a promise you can't keep. I'm asking you to be sure." He turned and looked at her fully. The morning light was in her eyes, those gray-green eyes, and they were serious and clear. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name without the formality of ma'am, and he watched her notice it, watched something move in her expression. "I am more sure of this than I have been of anything in recent years. That is the honest truth." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once, with the decisive finality of a woman who, once she has decided something, does not revisit the decision. "I'll write to my cousin and tell her we'll be staying on," she said. "And I'll need you to look at the root cellar today. I think the east wall is beginning to buckle, and we need it sound before the hard cold comes." "I'll look at it this morning," he said. "Good," she said. And she turned and walked back toward the house, and the frost crackled lightly under her boots, and Amos Covington stood at the edge of that field feeling something large and warm and complicated moving through his chest, and he let it move. There was something in this territory that white settlers had taken without permission or payment, and Amos knew it, because he had passed through enough of the former Osage, and Kaw land to understand what the open prairie had cost people who had lived there for generations before any white hand drove a survey stake. He was not a man who spoke about this loudly, because in 1878 on the Kansas frontier, you did not speak about such things without consequence. But he held it in his thinking, the knowledge that the land he admired had a different history than the one told in land offices and newspapers. He had traded fairly with every calm man and woman he had encountered, and he had not participated in the removals, and he knew those things were insufficient, but they were what he had. When he thought about building something on this land, he thought about it with a responsibility that included the ground under his boots and not just the sky above them. The winter came in earnest in November, and with it came a kind of enforced proximity that changed things between Amos and Clara in ways that neither of them entirely directed. On the bad cold nights, when the temperature dropped below what the barn could comfortably sustain, Clara had him move into the house and sleep in the small room off the kitchen that had been used for storage. She made this arrangement with a brisk practicality that made it clear it was a decision about Frost and not about anything else, and Amos accepted it with the same briskness and slept there without comment. But sleeping under the same roof changes a thing, even between people being very careful. The boys were aware of it, in the particular alert way that children notice the things adults are trying not to notice themselves. Eli asked, one morning at the breakfast table, in the direct manner of a 9-year-old, "Are you going to marry our mama?" The silence at the table was the kind that has a specific texture. Clara set down her ladle. Amos set down his coffee cup. Thomas looked at his plate with the studied neutrality of a boy trying to pretend he was not extremely interested in the answer. Sam watched from behind his cornbread. Henry, unaware of the weight of the moment, had his face in his porridge. "Eli," Clara said with careful steadiness, "that's not a question we need at the breakfast table. But is it a question we can have at another table?" Eli pressed, because 9 years old had not yet installed the mechanism that moderates such questions. "Eli, I'm just asking because Thomas said—" "Thomas," Clara said, turning her gaze to her eldest son, who became extremely interested in a knot in the table's wood. "I only said that he's been here 2 months, Thomas said, his voice carrying a studied innocence that convinced no one. Amos picked up his coffee cup again and looked at it for a moment. He had the sense that the room was waiting for him to say something, and that what he said would matter, and he wanted to say it right. "I care about your family," he said, addressing the table generally and each boy specifically. "That is a true thing, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. What that means going forward is something your mother and I would talk about privately if there was anything to talk about." He looked around the table. "But what I can tell you right now with my whole chest is that I am not going anywhere. Not in February and not in spring. This farm has my attention and so do all of you." He paused. "Is that fair enough?" Thomas was looking at him now, the studied neutrality replaced by something very young and very serious. "Yes," Thomas said, "that's fair enough." Eli seemed to feel this was not quite the satisfying direct answer he'd been hoping for, but subsided. Henry looked up from his porridge, apparently under the impression that something important had occurred, and said, "Can we have more porridge?" And Clara, who had been very still during Amos's speech, turned back to the stove with the ladle and said, "Henry, you can have all the porridge you want," in a voice that was not entirely steady, and Amos decided to let that pass without examination. That evening, after the boys were asleep, Clara found him in the barn checking on the horse and the 2 milk cows, which he did every night before he turned in. She came in with a lantern and stood near the door in her coat with the wind pushing at her from outside. "What you said at breakfast," she started. "I meant all of it," he said, not looking up from where he was checking the gray mare's near foreleg, which had been a little tender. "I know you did," she said. "That's what I wanted to say." A pause. "The boys need—" she stopped. "What I need you to understand is that they have lost one person who was certain. Their father was certain. He was here every morning and then he wasn't, and that does something to a child that doesn't fully repair." She paused. "I have spent 2 years being the certain one, and I am glad to do it. But you're tired," Amos said quietly. A silence. "Yes," she said, and it was barely a word, more like an exhale. He set down the mare's foot and straightened and turned to face her. The lantern light was between them, warm and unsteady. "Then let me be certain for a while," he said. Clara Hurst looked at him with those gray-green eyes full of something that was not quite tears but was in the same territory, and the lamplight moved on her face, and Amos thought that she was the most beautiful and the most real person he had seen in a very long time, and that those two things, the beauty and the realness, were not separate from each other in her case but were the same thing. He did not cross the space between them that night. It was not the right moment, and he was a man who understood the difference between the moment before a thing and the thing itself. But he held her gaze for a long count, and she held his, and when she turned and went back to the house, the warmth she left behind in the lantern light felt, to Amos Covington, like a promise. November passed into December, and December brought snow, and the snow brought a different kind of life to the Hurst farm. The boys were extraordinary in snow. Henry threw himself into it with total commitment, coming in red-cheeked and soaked and vibrating with the cold satisfaction of a small person who has made the most of things. Eli built a series of structures that he called fortifications, and which Thomas politely declined to engage with in battle, which gave Eli the opportunity to describe at length what the battle would have been like if Thomas had participated. Sam built 3 separate snowmen with careful attention to proportion, the third of which was recognizably a horse, and showed it to Amos with quiet pride. Amos looked at the snow horse and looked at Sam and said, "That is the best snow horse I have ever seen." Sam's face broke into a smile of such pure, unguarded pleasure that Amos felt something in his chest expand like a held breath being released. "I want to learn to draw," Sam told him with the serious intentness of a boy who has decided something important. "Real drawing, on paper." "Your mother has better handwriting than anyone I've seen," Amos said. "She might be a good person to ask about drawing too." Sam considered this. "She says she doesn't have time for drawing. Maybe this winter she will." Sam thought about this with great seriousness, and then nodded and went back to refining the snow horse's mane, and Amos filed away the information about Clara and drawing for later. He mentioned it to her that evening while they sat by the fire after supper, which had become their habit, the boys in bed, the two of them by the fire, sometimes talking and sometimes simply sitting in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over these months. "Did you draw?" he asked. Clara looked up from the mending in her lap. "Who told you that?" "Sam said you used to. He said you told him you don't have time anymore." Clara looked at the mending in her hands. "There was a time when Thomas and I had evenings for things like that." Before, she paused. "I used to draw portraits, people's faces mostly." She paused again. "I was tolerably good at it." "Sam has your eye for proportion," Amos said. "That snow horse he built today was remarkably accurate." Clara smiled at the fire. It was a real smile, warm and private, the smile of a mother who is hearing something good about her child when she thought no one was paying attention. "He's been like that since he could hold a rock and scratch on the barn boards," she said. "He told me he wants to learn to draw on paper. He could use yours if you have any left." Clara was quiet for a moment. "There's a sketchbook in the chest upstairs. Thomas gave it to me the winter we came to Kansas." A pause. "I haven't opened it since March of '76. Amos did not press. He let the silence sit. After a moment, Clara set down the mending and looked at him. "Why are you being so careful with us?" she asked. He raised his eyebrows slightly. "Am I?" "You are," she said. "You notice everything. You notice what the boys need and you find a way to give it to them without making a show of it. You notice what I need in you." She stopped. "You are very careful with us," she said again. "You are worth being careful with," he said. The fire snapped and settled between them. Clara looked at him for a long moment and then she said quietly, "Amos, yes. I want to tell you something." "All right. I have been trying very hard not to." She stopped. "I have been trying to be practical about this, about you, because it is very important to me to be practical about things, about decisions that affect my children." "That's wise," he said. "It is," she agreed. "It is very wise, and I have been being very wise." A pause, and I find that I am running out of whys." He looked at her, she looked at him. "Clara," he said very carefully. "Don't be careful right now," she said, and so he was not. He moved to sit beside her on the bench near the fire, close enough that their shoulders were touching, and he took her hand, which was work-roughened and warm from the mending, and held it in both of his. She turned her hand in his and held back, and they sat like that in the firelight while the December wind moved against the windows and the house was warm and the boys were asleep upstairs and everything outside the circle of the fire's light was a different world from this one. "I am not going to move too fast," he said. "I mean that." "I know you do," she said, "but I want to say clearly I am here. I am staying. And whatever you will allow me to be to you and to these boys, I will be that for the rest of my life if you'll have me." Clara looked at their joined hands for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were bright but not spilling. "You are a remarkable man, Amos Covington," she said. "I'm a fairly ordinary man," he said. "I just happened to come by at the right time." "No," she said firmly. "Do not be modest about this. You are remarkable, and I am going to need you to know that I see that because I think you have spent 3 years not being particularly seen." He was quiet because she was right and there was nothing to say to being right. "I see you," Clara said. "I have been seeing you since you knocked on my door at dawn with your hat at your chest." She paused. "I knew you were going to be trouble then." He laughed, a real laugh surprised out of him. "Trouble? The good kind," she said. "The kind that changes things." He brought her hand up and pressed it briefly to his lips, old-fashioned and courteous, and meant with every fiber of the gesture. Clara exhaled slowly, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that in front of the fire for a long time while the December night moved past the windows, and it was the kind of peace that takes a long time to earn. Christmas came to the Hurst farm with a simplicity that would have seemed like poverty to some people and felt, to those inside it, like abundance. There was no money for grand gifts, but Amos had spent 3 weeks' worth of evenings carving, a small horse for Henry, a proper writing slate frame for Sam to replace his broken one, a jackknife with a smooth handle for Eli, who had coveted Amos's with a longing that was too transparent to miss, and for Thomas, a leather-bound journal purchased on a supply trip to the town 9 miles north. Because Amos had noticed the boy writing things in the margins of his school books and understood that the habit needed room. Clara had spent her evenings sewing new shirts for all 4 boys and had produced, additionally, a fine pair of warm gloves for Amos from leather she had cut from an old coat, with a precision and skill that made them fit his large hands perfectly. He stood on Christmas morning holding the gloves and looking at the fit of them and felt something very warm move through him. "You measured my hands," he said. "I traced them while you were sleeping," Clara said cheerfully, and then she appeared to register what that implied and turned quickly back to the stove with color in her cheeks, and Eli said, "How?" And Thomas said quickly, "Eli," and a breakfast conversation of some complexity ensued. The new year came in on a night of hard, clear cold and brilliant stars, and Amos and Clara stood on the porch long after the boys had been put to bed and watched the sky, and did not speak very much, because there was nothing that needed saying that wasn't already being said by the stars and the cold, and the fact that they were standing close enough that their arms were touching. Clara turned her face up toward him and he looked down at her, and the starlight was on her face, and he kissed her for the first time, gentle and careful and honest, and she kissed him back with a warmth that was the warmth of a woman who does nothing halfway, and the January cold was absolutely irrelevant to the proceedings. When they separated, Clara pressed her forehead against his jaw for a moment. "Happy New Year," she said quietly. "Happy New Year," he said into her hair. She pulled back and looked at him. Her eyes were bright and her cheeks were cold-flushed, and she looked entirely like herself, entirely like the woman who had opened a door at dawn with a skillet in her hand and measured him for worthiness. And he found that he loved her for that quality above almost all others, the quality of being absolutely, unflinchingly herself. January passed in a deepening warmth between them that was expressed in small ways, in the way they moved around each other in the kitchen, in the morning's shoulder on the porch, in the evenings by the fire that sometimes went late, in the way Clara would look across the room at him, sometimes with an expression that said, clearly, "I am glad you are here," and in the way he would look back and say the same thing without words. Thomas had settled into a relationship with Amos that Amos was careful to treat with the respect it deserved. He was not trying to be the boy's father. Thomas had a father, an excellent one by all accounts, whose photograph on the mantelpiece Thomas kept polished with the faithful attention of someone tending a small flame. Amos was trying to be something different, an elder, a teacher, a steady presence. And Thomas seemed to understand this and accept it, and in accepting it, to relax incrementally into something that was more like ordinary boyhood and less like premature adulthood. One afternoon in February, Thomas asked him with careful directness, "Do you love my mother?" Amos was splitting wood. He set down the axe. "Yes," he said, "I do." Thomas picked up one of the split pieces and turned it in his hands. "She hasn't been happy since my father died. I mean, she's been fine. She's done everything right, but there's a kind of happy that went away." He turned the wood again. "It's been coming back," he said, "since you came." Amos looked at the boy, 12 years old, an old soul, doing his best with an impossible standard set by love and loss. "Your mother is the strongest person I have ever met," Amos said. "I know," Thomas said. "She doesn't need anyone." "No," Amos agreed. "She doesn't. But there's a difference between needing someone and choosing them." He paused. "Your father was chosen, I think, not needed." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father would have said something like that." He picked up his portion of the wood and carried it to the pile, and Amos watched him go and thought that there are certain kinds of grace that appear in 12-year-old boys that make a man feel he is in the presence of something rare and worth protecting. February turned the corner into a late winter thaw, and Amos began to think seriously about the spring planting. He sat down with Clara in the evenings, and they worked through the numbers together, he with his knowledge of soil and yield, she with her intimate knowledge of what this particular land had produced in its better years. They planned wheat for the south field and corn for the middle, and Clara had strong and accurate opinions about both, which made the planning both more complicated and more interesting. "You know your land," he said to her one evening, looking at the sketch she had made of the fields. "This is my land," she said simply. "I know it the way I know my children, not because someone told me about it, because I've been in it with my hands." There was something in the way she said it, my land, my children, that made him look at her across the table, and something in his look made her look up, and she set down the pencil. "Amos," she said, "I think you had better ask me." He stared at her. She looked back, steady and clear. "Ask you what?" he said carefully, though he knew exactly. "You know what?" she said. "Clara Hurst," he said slowly, "are you proposing that I propose to you?" The corner of her mouth turned up. "I am being practical," she said. "I have 4 boys who will want to plant the south field in April and a man in my kitchen who I intend to keep there. I am telling you that the ask is welcome." She paused. "I have also been practicing what I intend to say when you do ask, and it would be a shame to waste the preparation." Amos pushed back from the table and stood, and then thought about it and went down on one knee, because Clara Hurst deserved the full ceremony even in a farm kitchen with corn plans on the table between them, and he looked up at her and said, "I am not a wealthy man and this is not a conventional courtship, but I am as certain as I have ever been of anything. Clara Hurst, would you do me the extraordinary honor of marrying me?" Clara sat with her hands folded on the table, looking down at him with an expression of such open, uncomplicated happiness that he felt it like a physical warmth in his chest. "Yes," she said, "I would." He rose and she rose, and he folded her into his arms and held her there in the kitchen while the fire in the stove ticked and settled, and she pressed her face into his shoulder, and her arms went around him with a strength that surprised him and then didn't, because he had watched Clara Hurst do everything with her whole self. The boys' reactions were distributed across the full range of boyhood response. Henry, informed at breakfast, immediately asked if there would be cake. Eli demanded to know all procedural details and whether Amos would officially be their father or something else, with the expectation that the question had a specific correct answer. Sam looked at both of them for a long moment and then said, "Good," with the quiet finality of a boy who had been waiting to be allowed to feel something and had just been given permission. Thomas, privately, when Amos found him at the barn after breakfast, said nothing at all for a moment and then said, "My father's birthday is in April. We always do something to mark it." A pause. "I want you to know that. We'll mark it every year," Amos said. Thomas nodded once, and something in him settled like a door closing gently and securely. They were married in March of 1879, on the first genuinely warm day of the year, in the front room of the farmhouse with the minister from the church 9 miles north and the neighbor woman from 6 miles east, whose name was Grace Millward, and who arrived with 3 jars of preserved peaches, and a look of such unabashed satisfaction at the whole arrangement that Clara hugged her for a long time on the porch before the ceremony. Grace Millward, as it turned out, had known about Amos Covington since November, because Clara had ridden the 6 miles in December to tell her, because Grace was one of those rare friends who made honesty feel safe, and Grace had apparently told Clara that if she let him go she was a fool, which was the kind of thing Grace Millward said with perfect love. The ceremony was simple and genuine. When Amos said "I do," he said it looking straight at Clara, and Clara said "I do" looking straight at him, and the minister said something about 2 people becoming one, and the boys sat in a row on the bench, Thomas upright and composed, Eli sideways watching the whole proceedings with intense scholarly interest, Sam holding Henry's hand, Henry wearing his best shirt, which he had buttoned incorrectly, and which no one had corrected because it seemed important to let him feel accomplished. Amos kissed his wife in front of the minister and the neighbor and the 4 boys and the spring sunlight coming through the farmhouse window, and Clara kissed him back with a warmth and a rightness that felt, to both of them, like arriving somewhere they had been traveling toward without knowing it. Spring planting was everything Amos had planned for and more. The winter had been wet enough in its later weeks to bring the water table up, and the south field, when Amos turned the soil in mid-April, was dark and rich under its dry crust, exactly the kind of soil he had been hoping for. He and Thomas plowed side by side, the boy handling a plow with a skill that his father had clearly started teaching him, and which Amos was glad to continue. Eli drove the seed wagon with great competence and zero restraint, delivering a running commentary on the relative merits of different corn varieties that he had researched from a seed catalog, with an attention to detail that Clara said was either going to make him a great farmer or a great lawyer. Sam planted the kitchen garden alone and with great deliberation, following the same rows Clara had laid out for 2 years but adding at the edges a line of sunflowers that Clara had not asked for but which, when they came up in July, made her stand in the garden doorway for a full minute before she said anything. She turned and found Sam standing behind her, watching her face. "Do you like them?" he said. "Sam," she said, "they are the most beautiful things on this farm." He looked satisfied and went back to his drawing, which Clara had resumed teaching him in the evenings with the sketchbook from the chest, the one Thomas Sr. had given her, opened now and in use again, mother and son sitting at the table while the lamp burned between them, and the house was warm with the spring. Henry, for his part, planted 6 potato sets with Amos's guidance, and then lost interest in planting entirely, and turned his attention to a family of ground squirrels living under the barn, which he was attempting to befriend through the application of cornmeal left near their burrow each morning. Progress was slow, but he was committed. The summer of 1879 was a revelation. It was not a perfect season. No Kansas summer was perfect. But the rain came reasonably, and the heat was fierce but steady rather than killing. And the wheat came up in the south field in the way that good wheat comes up when the soil and the weather cooperate, in long green rows that turned gold in July with a beauty that Amos felt in his bones. He stood at the edge of the south field in late July and watched the wheat move in the wind, and Clara came and stood beside him with her hand in his, and they watched it together. "Thomas said this would be wheat country," she said. "Thomas was right," Amos said. "He was usually right about the land," Clara said. There was no grief in her voice, just a plain affection for the truth. She had found a way to hold her first husband's memory with both hands, as something good and real that had happened, and that had given her 4 extraordinary boys, without letting the holding of it prevent her from holding anything else. Amos had never asked her to put it down, and she had never expected him to be immune to it, and that was one of the things that worked best between them. "He would have liked this harvest," Amos said. "He would have liked you," Clara said. "That's what Thomas said." They stood in the wheat field until the evening light began to go, and then they walked back to the house together, where supper was on the stove, and the boys were arguing cheerfully about something involving the ground squirrels, and the lamp in the window was burning warm and steady. The harvest that fall was the best the Hurst farm had produced in its history. The wheat from the south field came in well above what Amos had projected, enough to sell a substantial portion in Caldwell and retain a good seed stock for next year. The corn was solid. The kitchen garden produced enough to fill the root cellar with comfortable margins. Grace Millward came over for 3 days to help with the preserving, and she and Clara worked side by side at the stove with the industrious, focused efficiency of 2 women who know what they're doing and are glad to do it together. On the last evening of harvest, Amos sat on the porch steps with all 4 boys around him in the warm October dark, looking at the field that was now cut clean and resting, and Thomas said, "Papa would have been proud of this field," and then caught himself because he had said Papa, and he looked quickly at Amos with a complicated expression. Amos looked at him steadily and said, "That's all right, Thomas." "I didn't mean, I know what you meant," Amos said. "Both things can be true at once. You can be proud of this field, and so can he, and so can I." He looked around at the other boys. "This family has more than one good man who cared about it. That's not a problem, that's a kind of wealth." Thomas sat with this for a moment. Then he said, "You are very strange sometimes." "I am," Amos agreed. "I mean that in the good way." "I know." Eli, who had been waiting for the philosophical portion of the evening to conclude so he could address a more urgent matter, said, "Can we talk about what we're going to plant in the West Field next year? Because I have been doing some reading." "Oh no," said Thomas. "What kind of reading?" said Amos. And Eli launched into it, and the October night wrapped around all of them warm and dark, and Clara came out with a pot of cider and sat on the porch above them, and listened to Eli explain the potential advantages of sorghum cultivation with the fond, exhausted expression of a woman who would not trade 1 minute of any of this for anything. She caught Amos's eye in the dark, and he looked up at her, and she smiled at him, and that smile was every morning on the porch with the coffee, and every evening by the fire, and every kiss under the January stars, and every inch of the wheat field, and every one of the 4 boys between them. And he held it the way you hold the best things with both hands, carefully, knowing its worth. Winter came again, and this winter was different from the last. There was enough food in the root cellar to be genuinely comfortable, enough wood in the barn to be warm, enough money from the harvest sale to think about a new section of fencing in the spring, and possibly a new plow. Amos had purchased a second horse, a solid bay gelding which gave them real mobility for the first time, and Clara had ordered a proper set of school books for the boys from a catalog in Kansas City. In November, Clara told him that she was expecting. She told him quietly one morning on the porch, handing him his coffee with her eyes carrying something enormous. Amos took the coffee and looked at her. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "In the spring," she said. "I think late April or May." He set the coffee down very carefully on the porch rail and turned to her and put both his hands on either side of her face with a tenderness that made her close her eyes for a moment, and he said, "Clara." "I know," she said. "How do you feel?" "I feel very well," she said. I felt terrible with all 4 boys in the early weeks, but right now I feel very well." She opened her eyes. "I am also slightly terrified." "Of what?" "Of doing this again," she said honestly. "Of the part at the end. The first time with Thomas it was fine. The second time with Eli it was hard. With Sam I nearly—" she stopped. "And then Henry was fine, but it's a thing you don't forget." "I'll be here," he said. "You had better be," she said. "I will be here," he said, with all the weight he could put into 5 words. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, and they stood like that in the November cold with the steam rising from the coffee between them, and the farm was quiet, and the sky was the pale gray of a day deciding what kind of day to be. Telling the boys was its own event. Henry was immediately interested in whether the baby would be a boy or a girl, and spent several weeks afterward informing everyone he met in the town that he was going to have a baby, and that he thought it should be a girl, but he would accept a boy. Eli asked 17 questions about the logistics of the situation with such relentless scientific inquiry that Clara eventually handed him the one medical book she owned and told him to read the relevant section. Sam said nothing for several days and then appeared at Amos's elbow in the barn one afternoon and said, "I want to draw the baby's portrait, when it comes." "That's a fine idea," Amos said. "I've been practicing people's faces," Sam said. "I'm getting better at eyes." "I know. I've seen you working on them." Sam looked up at him with those serious, careful eyes. "I want the baby to know what it looks like when it was small," he said. "I don't have a portrait of myself when I was a baby. I think I would have liked to have one." Amos looked at this boy, this quiet, observant, generous-spirited boy, and thought that Sam Hurst was one of the most remarkable people he had ever encountered, and that the world was going to find this out in its own time. "Your mother has your father's sketchbook," Amos said. "She might have drawn you when you were small if you asked her." Sam's face did something complicated and hopeful, and he turned and went toward the house at a pace that was almost running, and Amos heard, a few minutes later, the sound of the chest upstairs being opened, and then Clara's voice, and then a long silence, and then what he was almost certain was both of them talking quietly together, the particular tone of a mother and a son finding something together that had been waiting to be found. April came with a rush of warmth and new green and the business of another planting season, and Clara worked alongside Amos in the garden, and the fields right up until the middle of the month, when her body made it clear that this was no longer a reasonable option, and she stepped back from the heavy work with a practical grace and turned her attention to the house and the preserving and the boys' schoolwork with the same focused energy she applied to everything. On the 27th of April, 1880, in the farmhouse on the rise above Becker's Creek, Clara gave birth to a boy. Amos was present for the entire thing, which was not the common practice of the time but which Clara had made clear was not open for negotiation, and he had been there at the beginning and throughout, holding her hand when she needed it and staying out of the midwife's way when he needed to. And when the midwife placed the boy in his arms, he stood there in the warm April room with this small new person looking up at him, and he was absolutely undone. Clara, exhausted and luminous in the way of women who have just done something extraordinary, watched him from the bed. "He looks like you," she said. Amos looked at the baby and then up at her. His voice, when he found it, was not entirely steady. "He's beautiful." "He is," she agreed. She held out her hands and he gave the boy back to her, and she settled the baby against her and looked down at him with that expression that has no real name, the expression that appears on a person's face when they are looking at the thing they love most in the world. "What do we call him?" Amos asked, sitting on the edge of the bed beside her. Clara looked at the baby for a long moment. "I want to call him William," she said. "After my father." She looked up. "If that's all right." "It's more than all right," Amos said. "And Amos for his middle name," she said quietly, "if you'll permit me." He looked at her. She looked back. "William Amos Covington," she said. He did not say anything for a moment because there was nothing adequate to say. He bent forward and kissed her hair, and she leaned against him, the baby between them, and the April light came through the window warm and steady. The boys met William with their characteristic individuality. Henry was briefly confused about whether this was the boy or the girl he had requested, and then declared that he preferred boys after all, and that William was his specifically. Eli examined William with the expression of a boy encountering a new piece of equipment, and immediately began researching infant development. Sam sat beside his mother on the bed and looked at the baby for a long time without speaking, and then went to his room and returned with a piece of paper on which he had, apparently in the previous month, drawn a small empty cradle with a blanket turned down, waiting. He put the drawing on the bedside table without comment. Clara reached out and took his hand and squeezed it, and Sam sat beside her while the afternoon went on. Thomas held William last with a careful solemnity, supporting the head correctly. He had clearly asked someone how to do this, and he looked at the small face and then at his mother and said, simply, "We've got enough room for him." And there was everything in that sentence, all the fear and the protectiveness and the opening of a door. "We do," Clara said. "We have plenty of room." The summer of 1880 was the best the farm had ever seen. The wheat in the south field came in heavy and clean. The west field, which Amos had planted with the sorghum that Eli had spent a full winter researching, produced better than expected. The corn was excellent. The kitchen garden, under Sam's faithful attention, and with the sunflowers he added every year at the edges, was full and varied. The root cellar was filled to its walls by October. They hired a hand for the harvest, a young man from the town named Pete Darrow, 17 years old and so tall he had to angle himself through the barn door, who worked with enormous earnestness and a complete lack of natural aptitude for farming, but who improved visibly by the day under Amos and Thomas's patient instruction. Thomas, at 14, had become Amos's genuine partner on the farm, understanding the land and the seasons and the animals with a deepening competence that made Amos deeply glad. On the last day of harvest, the whole family stood at the edge of the south field in the October evening, Clara with William on her hip, Amos with his arm around her, Thomas and Eli on either side, Sam and Henry in front, and they looked at the cut field and the full barn and the farmhouse with its lamp burning warm in the window, and no one said anything for a moment because there was nothing to say that the field didn't already say better. Then Henry said, "Can we have supper now?" And that was right, too. Amos Covington, in the years that followed, became as much a part of that Kansas land as the creek that ran below it, as the wheat that came up every summer in the south field, as the lamp in the window that had been burning on the morning he rode up the slope. He was a man who had arrived by chance and stayed by choice, and the staying was the whole of the story. Clara was 40 years old when their second child together arrived, a girl this time, small and fierce, who came into the world in January of 1883 as the snow came down outside the farmhouse window, and who was named Jane after Amos's mother, who was still alive in Tennessee, and who received a letter about her granddaughter in the spring, and wrote back a letter of 3 pages full of practical advice, and what was clearly, between the lines of the practical advice, an enormous joy. Thomas was 17 when Jane was born, and treated her with the careful tenderness he had learned to apply to all the things that needed protecting, which were many and which he catalogued faithfully. Eli, 15, and already talking about Kansas Agricultural College with a focused ambition that surprised no one who knew him, became Jane's unofficial research department, providing Clara with 3 separate pamphlets on infant nutrition that he had obtained from somewhere. Sam, 13, began a series of drawings of his sister from the day of her birth that would eventually fill an entire sketchbook, and which Clara would keep for the rest of her life. Henry, 10, held Jane with the practiced confidence of a boy who had been preparing for a sibling for 3 years, and proceeded to make her laugh earlier than anyone expected. William, who was 3 when Jane was born, took one look at her, thought about it for several days, and then decided she was acceptable, which was, from William Amos Covington, high praise. The spring of 1884 brought something new to the territory. The railroad had been expanding south and west through Kansas for years, and a spur line was coming through the county that would put a proper station 9 miles north in the town. And suddenly, what had been a half-day's wagon journey to sell grain or buy supplies would be a fraction of that. Amos and Clara sat on the porch in the spring evening and looked at the news in the week-old Caldwell newspaper that Pete Darrow, now their full-time hired hand at 21, had brought out from the town, and they thought about what it meant. "Wheat prices will change," Amos said. "More access to the eastern markets." "Everything will change," Clara said. "The whole county." She was quiet for a moment. "It's not always a bad thing. Change." He looked at her. She was looking at the field, which was green and growing, and she had Jane in her lap, and the lamp was on inside the house throwing its warm orange light through the window, and she looked so thoroughly right, so thoroughly in her own place, that he felt the whole of the past 6 years in that one image. "No," he said, "it's not." She turned to him and smiled, and it was the same smile she had given him across the dark October porch 3 years in, the one that held everything, and he reached out and took her hand and held it. "Are you happy?" she asked. It was not an anxious question. It was the genuine curiosity of a woman who values honesty. "Clara," he said, "I rode a creek trail at the wrong time of year and found a light burning in a window, and that light has not gone out since." He looked at her. "Yes, I am happy. I'm the happiest I have ever been or expected to be." She looked at him for a moment, measuring him in that way she had, and then she nodded with the decisive certainty of a woman who has checked her information and found it sound. "Good," she said. "So am I." The lamp in the farmhouse window burned on into the evening, as it always did, as it had on the night that had started everything. That ordinary and extraordinary night when Clara Hurst had sat up through the dark hours with her 4 boys and her worries, and had decided, as she always decided, that the dark was something to be illuminated and not surrendered to. That was the character of the woman, and it was the character of the life they had built together, and Amos knew it and loved it with the same completeness. He had come up the slope at dawn on a gray mare because a light in a window had stopped him cold in the saddle, and the world had turned, quietly and permanently, in the space of one sunrise. The south field was full of wheat. The root cellar was full. The boys, 5 of them now, counting William, with Jane growing into the voice of the household with a speed that astonished her father, were asleep or nearly so in the house behind them. The farm was sound and the land was good, and the creek below ran clear in the spring evening. Amos Covington looked at his wife in the lamplight and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that the best things in his life had arrived in the form of a light burning in the dark, and a woman brave enough to open the door. And that was, truly, the whole of it. The farm stood on the rise above Becker's Creek for many years after, a solid, well-kept piece of Kansas land with good fences, and a kitchen garden with sunflowers at the edges, and a lamp in the window that burned through the evenings until the family was settled, and the night was quiet, and everything was, at last, entirely, deeply well.